this is what keeps me up at night about the drug importation programs, the safety concerns. I'm a pharmacist. I want to make sure that my patients are getting safe and effective drugs. And that's what all pharmacists are looking to. So the first part of that standard is important. And there are several places for failure in the importation process where mischief can occur, allowing counterfeit and substandard drugs to be imported and get into the supply chain.
This is Real Pharma, your podcast for real conversations with pharma pathfinders. In every episode, you will hear from an industry insider who has a story to share that goes beyond the headlines. No spin, no sacred cows, no hidden agendas, just stories and the people behind them. Now, here are your hosts, Dr. Nari O and Ian Wendt.
Welcome back to the Real Pharma Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Wendt, accompanied by the scintillating Dr. Nari O. In this episode, we're excited to welcome Ilisa Bernstein, a prominent figure in the world of pharmacy and an executive at the American Pharmacists Association, APHA, where she currently serves as a senior vice president and was previously their interim CEO. With a career that blends clinical expertise with advocacy, Ilisa has been at the forefront of shaping pharmacy practice and policy. Her role at APHA involves driving initiatives that not only enhance the role of pharmacists in healthcare, but also ensure the safe and effective use of medications in the community. A registered pharmacist herself, Ilisa holds a Doctor of Pharmacy degree and a law degree. Her experience also includes working with the FDA, where she played a crucial role in medication safety and regulatory compliance. Ilisa is also known for her passionate commitment to advancing the pharmacy profession, her deep knowledge of drug policy, and her advocacy for the critical role pharmacists play in patient health. Her insights are sure to enlighten us about the rapidly evolving landscape of drug importation policies, and we welcome her to the show. Thank you for joining us, Ilisa.
Thanks, Ian and Ari. Thanks for chatting with me on your podcast and having me here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, this is certainly a hot topic, one that I've seen in the news, perhaps others have as well. And while this might be a newer topic for some of us to think about because of what's going on in Florida, and we'll get to that, I understand there's a long history here that's gotten us to this point. And I thought maybe a useful place to start is for you to fill us in a little bit on what's been going on over the last couple of decades that got us to this point where we actually are about to, or maybe have drugs being imported from Canada in this case.
Yeah, so thanks. This is a topic that's near and dear to me. I've been working on it from within FDA and now in the private sector. They're really looking through it through a consumer and a pharmacy lens for over 20 years. So in the early 2000s, I won't bore you with all the history, but let me just set the stage here. Because in the early 2000s, a few things were going on related to drugs in this country. So prices were increasing. The internet was becoming a place to buy things. It was exploding, and including drugs. And patients were buying drugs from rogue internet pharmacies. So because of these increased prices, more counterfeit drugs were getting into the United States through many vulnerabilities in the drug supply chain. And so in about 2003, a number of things came together. Congress passed the Medicare Modernization Act, which included authorization of drug importation in the law. And it said that drug importation can be done if it would pose no additional risk to the public's health and safety and would offer significant reduction in cost. And let me underline that, significant reduction in cost to the U.S. consumer. So this was the safety and the cost aspect were significant triggers for drug importation. And it's the standard that must be passed for a program to be authorized by FDA. So back in 2003, a government-wide task force was put together and established by the U.S. Surgeon General at the time. And the task force looked at what's needed to ensure safety and what's needed for that significant reduction in cost. And I was at the FDA at the time, and I was seconded to work with the Surgeon General to produce the task force report. And we had several hearings in the United States. We met with foreign counterparts. And we also went down a whole lot of rabbit holes looking at the economics. Well, not me, because I am not an economist, but we did look at those things. And we looked at what's happening in the supply chain, what technologies were there, what the drug prices were, even the intellectual property aspects. And the law required FDA to write regulations to implement the drug importation program. And FDA took nearly 2 decades studying those findings and then more in order to write the regulations. And so those regulations really outline what a program must have and what those guardrails are, such as which drugs are in and out, what entities are part of this program or can be part of the program, what's needed, and other safety and cost assurances that are needed for the public. So it became a really tall bar in order to have a drug importation program, which is why it took so long. And that opened the door to Florida, Colorado, Maine, New Mexico, New Hampshire, Vermont. I think that's it right now, that have submitted proposals. So that's where we are today, in a nutshell, from 2000 to now.
Yeah, and thanks for the background there. I had no idea it kind of went that far back. I don't know if we should be surprised that it takes 2 decades to arrive at some policy recommendations here. Okay, I think Florida, you can help me understand this. I think Florida is kind of in the lead, at least that's the one that seems to show up in the news the most, in terms of actually putting actions in place to bring drugs in from Canada. And you kind of highlighted one point, I think that's a requirement by the FDA, that it needs to result in significant cost savings for the patient. So is that part of the design of Florida's program? Do they anticipate that? I assume that has to be one of their goals. Do we have an idea of what percent savings that a patient might realize here by using these medications?
Well, it's unclear. It's a really good question, but it's unclear because according to the Florida governor, the drug importation program in Florida will save them $180 billion in the first year. And Florida sees this as a way to bring Canadian prices to Floridians. But that's far from what's going on here. For an importation program to be approved, as I said, it has to significantly reduce costs, but there's been no transparency into the math and the savings. And there was a statement that FDA reviewed the economics and the cost savings, but that's it. We haven't seen anything to really show what will happen. And it's hard to imagine that imported drugs can come at a lower cost. So given all that would need to be done for those drugs to comply, because every product must have an appropriate sample size of doses that are tested for authenticity and degradation, and that costs money. And every package needs to be relabeled to have the US approved labeling on it. That costs money. Every time the product changes hands, and each of them wants a piece of the pie. So that costs money. And in the end, all of this ticks up the price. Another aspect is the Florida importation program is for state programs, like for people who are participating in different state programs, such as Medicaid. Medicaid gets the lowest prices in the United States for their beneficiaries. And there was a third-party analysis that was done just looking at the main Medicaid program for spending that when it was considering importing, and it found that the Medicaid program would actually lose close to $1 million if they imported drugs. And that's a small state. So it's hard to imagine, and without seeing the numbers, it's imagine, because there's no transparency, that the imported drugs will provide a substantial cost savings for the consumer.
So just to follow up on making sure I understand the cost of the consumer issue, because you touched on exactly what I was thinking. If this is a Medicaid population, their out-of-pocket is, and I don't know exactly how Florida Medicaid might be structured, but their out-of-pockets for their prescription fills are very low. They might be $0 or $5, like a lot of states are like that. If the intent is to pass along the savings to the actual consumers of the product, there's not much benefit there you can really offer. Now, you can maybe offer benefit to the taxpayers, right, who are footing the bill for the program, but that's not the consumer of the medication. So is Florida looking at this in terms of just this is going to save our Medicaid system money, or do they really think the savings are going to be passed on to the consumer? Because it's hard to imagine how the consumer actually sees some benefit here.
You are exactly right. That's why with no transparency in what happened and what the numbers look like, we can't tell. But that's exactly what's happening in the Medicaid program. They pay a lower amount. And it also, these other state programs, that are included in the Florida proposal, these are all patients that are already paying lower copays or no copays at all. So the standard in the law is the standard that's in the law, and it's unclear what, as I said, what the math is. And even you're not importing Canadian prices, and those may be higher for these patients as well.
The other consideration that you mentioned, Ilisa, is obviously safety. How do we know that issues that have come up in the past with counterfeit drugs or substandard medications where equivalent safety was not guaranteed or not guaranteeable are not something that we will have to deal with here? What are the mechanisms in place to make sure that the second criterion, cost and safety, as you mentioned, is covered appropriately?
This is what keeps me up at night about the drug importation programs, the safety concerns. I'm a pharmacist. I want to make sure that my patients are getting safe and effective drugs. And that's what all pharmacists are looking to. So the first part of that standard is important. And there are several places for failure in the importation process where mischief can occur, allowing counterfeit and substandard drugs to be imported and get into the supply chain. So, first and foremost, what are those drugs that are being imported and where are they getting them? Because manufacturers who sell drugs in Canada, they're putting in place strong export provisions in their contracts with wholesalers. So those wholesalers in Canada cannot export those drugs to the United States or sell them to someone who is exporting to the United States. The program requires that imported drugs be approved by the Canadian government. So if the source of the Canadian approved drugs is shut down via these contractual obligations, then where are they going to get these drugs? The black market or use drugs from other countries? That's scary. In the early 2000s, counterfeits of a widely used cholesterol drug, Lipitor, they were found to have reached pharmacies in the US. And that was a wake-up call to secure the supply chain. And the importation task force that I was a part of, at the same time, I was a part of a counterfeit drug task force. And that looked at the drug supply chain and both said that our US drug supply chain must be more secure. So as policy takes time in the United States, as we said about regulations, in 2013, a law was passed called the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, and that requires tracing of drugs through the supply chain. So a special barcode is now placed on each package by the manufacturer with a unique serial number, or it's a license plate, you can call it. And it enables a package to be traced as it moves through the supply chain from one owner to another, from the manufacturer to the pharmacy. And Canada does not have a law like this, a track and trace law or anything similar. So drugs for the Canadian market won't have this barcode. And when the products are imported under the drug importation law, they have to be relabeled with this barcode. To me, that's an opportunity to launder the history of the drug. So in the United States, you've got the ability to track and trace and know that history, but you don't. So it really starts at the border. You have no idea what happened to the drug before it comes to the border. So again, this opens the door to mischief and opportunities for counterfeit and substandard drugs to be swapped out for what it's supposed to be.
That's actually interesting because I hadn't thought about that. I guess when I was, kind of reading up on this a bit, I just imagined that what Florida was doing in other states would be importing drugs that were sitting on the pharmacy shelf in Canada, in a Canadian pharmacy for Canadians. And then some of that, I guess, would be used to supply the demand here through this importation scheme. But it sounds like maybe that is not the case, right? Canada might just be a stopover from drugs that originate somewhere else in the world, and they come into Canada. They're not intended for the Canadian patient population. They're just passing through Canada to end up in Florida. Is that kind of what you're getting at, that could occur?
It could occur. However, the program, according to the regulations, is it has to be a drug that is approved for the Canadian market.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But what I'm saying is there are so many hands that touch the product, provides more opportunities for mischief and where the products could be swapped out.
I wanted to follow up on something you said. It sounds like as you just clarified, the drug has to be approved for use in Canada. But what is the incentive for Canada to divert some of the supply to the US, besides all the logistical issues that you just mentioned? So you are putting your own drug supply chain at risk, potentially. You could have a shortage because you are taking some of this supply. It's still not really clear to me where the supply comes from. As you said earlier, you don't know where is this coming from, where are these drugs coming from. So they have to be approved for Canada, but the wholesalers don't really have the ability to export it to the US, if I'm understanding this correctly. So can you just take us through what is the theoretical scenario here from manufacturing to potential drug exportation? Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah, so the drug is approved for the Canadian market. A manufacturer will sell it to a Canadian wholesaler. And that's how it happens in the United States. Drugs go from manufacturer to wholesaler to pharmacy, and sometimes it does change hands in the United States to other wholesalers. In the program, it's going from the manufacturer to a wholesaler who may or may not be the foreign seller under the program that then sells it into the United States. And so there are the wholesalers that get the drugs in Canada legitimately. It's all part of the Canadian supply chain as well. And then the foreign seller wholesaler has to be registered in the United States under the drug importation program. But you raise a really important point, because Canadian health officials, including the health minister, they've expressed concerns about drug importation programs causing shortages in Canada. And they said that they will take all necessary measures to protect the Canadian drug supply. And even, I think it was about 2 months ago, the Canadian health minister met with Secretary Becerra in the United States, and they discussed this. And they talked about making sure that their country's supply is good, but there was no word on the specifics, and we're waiting to see what policies the Canadian government will put in place. The US market is 9 to 10 times the size of Canada, so drug importation could have a significant impact on Canadian supply. It could drain the Canadian supply if it becomes more widely used.
And it sounds like maybe it would be a little bit difficult to regulate that. So if an exporter is in the business of exporting drugs to the US, by the time the government is aware of a shortage and can take measures, and I don't even know what measures they could take, it's not like you can just flip the switch and say, we have to stop exporting certain drugs because there's an unexpected supply issue. It sounds like to me there are multiple parallel work streams here that might not be easy to combine.
No, absolutely. There's a strong sensitivity across the world about export-import trade policies. So I think they're being very careful and cautious here in terms of what they're saying in Canada. But they certainly mean business, and they have been very vocal about protecting the Canadian drug supply from shortages.
And I think we all saw that during COVID. It was a global issue. It became very political, of course.
Absolutely.
Well, obviously the FDA plays a role here, and they've kind of provided, I guess it's more than guidance, but policy on how this is supposed to work. You've already mentioned some of them. So it needs to be an approved drug available in Canada and obviously approved here. It needs to be, I suppose, repackaged, relabeled to U.S. standards. And then are they going to use the U.S. NDC number? That's the other question I had. I mean, are we going to have parallel NDC numbers so we can differentiate these two products? Is there any other distinctions on the packaging so that if I'm a consumer, I know, okay, this bottle originated in Canada? Do we have that type of transparency just from a consumer perspective that they might care?
The consumer may not be able to tell because it's going to be relabeled. It will have a different NDC number, National Drug Code number, that is on every package in the United States. And that's how you tell what the product is and link it back to the manufacturer. And pricing is tied to NDC numbers. It's a very important number in the United States. And so on these new products, not only will they have a new NDC number, but under that law that I was talking about before, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, that's an essential part of the license plate of each package as it moves through the supply chain, and it becomes part of that product identifier for each package. And so it's intended to really fit in to the drug supply chain in the same way, and a consumer will not be able to tell.
Yeah. Okay.
Another question, Ilisa, that I have is about IP, intellectual property. What issues do you see here with regards to IP rights?
So, although I didn't take intellectual property law in law school, and I'm not an IP law expert, that said, these importation schemes can violate international intellectual property laws if they're claiming to be something or use a trademark or trade dress without proper authorization. You know, that's the basis of our IP laws across the world. So I think more importantly, though, this is a disincentive to research and development by pharma. Yes, pharma companies make a whole lot of money, but it takes a lot of money to bring a drug to market, given the number of studies that are needed to demonstrate safety and efficacy. So we have the gold standard for approval in the US, and the rest of the world respects that and honors it. And as more products are more complex and more diseases are more complex and resistant to what's out there, researchers, particularly in the industry, need to continue to be innovative. So we need to ensure that appropriate incentives are in place, and drug importation can throw a wrench into that investment, you know, not only in just the IP side, but in that the incentives to invest side.
So not surprisingly, of course, the pharma industry is not happy with drug importation. Do you think that the biggest challenge or the biggest point of contention is indeed IP? Is it the lack of transparency with regards to ensuring safety, ensuring the supply chain, or is it the cost? Is it all of the above? If you had to put something down here, what would you go with, Ilisa?
I think there's a whole lot of things, because it really creates, I'm going to go back to that opportunities for mischief. A manufacturer spends a lot of money, not only on the research and development, but also on ensuring the quality of the product and ensuring that the product that they put in the marketplace stays the product that they put in the marketplace until it gets to the patient. And so the more areas where and touch points in the supply chain where things happen to that product, what it really throws things off. And I think that's where the problem occurs. Pharma has no incentive to participate in this program. And I can't imagine any company willing to sit down and be at the table with Florida or any of these states or be part of it. Pharma, a trade association, sued and petitioned FDA and lost. And so there's a lot vested in this, and we may see some more lawsuits coming now that the first state program was authorized. And in fact, I saw recently a document that came out of Colorado. Colorado gave an update to FDA about the program that they applied for. And it had the section at the end that talked about implementation barriers. And one of that is that they said that they approached 23 manufacturers and none would meet with them, and several didn't even respond. So that's how serious it is, because you want your products to be sold freely across the United States in every state. But these are not the products that they're putting in the marketplace the way that they put them in the marketplace. So I can see the significant concern.
Let me dive into that a little bit. Certainly, safety is of paramount importance, and cost to the consumer is obviously very important. I'll put my pharma commercial hat on here and maybe express some of the concerns that many of the manufacturers may have and why they may not be returning those calls or coming to the table. But when you think about the multiple discounts and rebates that occur, right, between the WAC or the wholesale acquisition cost, kind of the advertised price of a medication, and the amount of the net price, right, that the manufacturer actually realizes after all these discounts and other costs of doing business occur, that spread can be quite large. And they already have significant rebates in place for Medicaid and 340B. And I think one of the areas of focus for Florida is HIV medications. So there's AIDS drug assistance programs that provide additional rebates. And then there's all the commercial contracting piece. And so some of these potentially could be stacked rebates. So their margins aren't as high as the average person may guess on these medications. So then if we're bringing in these products ex-US, so through Canada in this situation, is there any mechanism to prevent those being eligible for rebates? It hardly seems fair because Canada kind of gets their rebates, let's say, upfront in the form of a lower price. And in the US, the system is different and the rebates are kind of taken on the back end, right? And so now manufacturers, I'm sure this is what they're feeling, are thinking, well, gee, I gave Canada kind of this upfront discount in a lower price. Then they're bringing those products in and now I'm subject to rebates again on the same product potentially that I've already discounted. So are there going to be mechanisms in place to prevent this double dipping almost from a rebate and discount perspective?
That's a really good question and a really interesting perspective because who knows? Because following the money is going to be very carefully watched over by everyone because right now there's so much smoke and mirrors in the whole process for rebates in this country. And this could actually even have an impact on Canadian prices and put upward pressure in Canada because right now, as manufacturers are saying, they're putting restrictions on export, but who's to say that they don't restrict supply to be sure that the Canadian pharmacies are only using the supply that they're needed to meet the Canadian patient demand and not taking that excess and sending it ex-Canada into the United States?
That was exactly going to be my question. What's the incentive to oversupply? Are we going to see much more restrictive export in the first instance where you have to either document what your expected usage is, or there are some penalties in place if you go above a certain quantity, for instance? I mean, we see some of these mechanisms in some of the European countries where there's a lot more scrutiny in the beginning before you even see any drug. Do you foresee something like that on the front end to manage this issue?
In Canada or in the US?
From the US to Canada.
I think that there's going to be clamping down all around in order to minimize the availability of product that can participate, drug product that can participate in this program. As we're seeing it now, it's unclear where it's going to come from. So that's a huge problem. And so wherever there are other places where product can be introduced into the marketplace, I think there are going to be mechanisms to try and clamp down on those as well. There's a lot of creativity when it comes to the sale and distribution of and pricing of drugs in the United States.
Well, and I'm sure there's teams of people at the larger manufacturers working on this problem as we speak. But generally, there's two mechanisms they probably have at their disposal. I mean, I'm sure there's a variety of smaller ones, but the significant ones might be they could restrict volume or access. Like they can say, look, we're only going to supply Canada as much drug as they need for their population. If you guys want this medication, then you better manage your supply appropriately so that you can meet the needs of your own population. The other thing they can do is just simply, and I think you mentioned this, increase the price. So if I'm a manufacturer and I look at, let's say, the profit my product is generated in Canada, but if the losses are larger through importation in the US than the profits I'm making in Canada, it's going to be a simple decision, I think, to simply just raise the price for Canada. Why wouldn't you? I mean, you really have no choice. You're underwater from a profit perspective. And look, these are for-profit companies and they're going to protect their interests from that perspective and for understandable reasons. But Canada, I mean, I would be worried if I were in Canada that this could put upward pressure on prices there with no really added benefit for their population, only downside for their population.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're going to see probably some of these policies put in place in Canada through the government of Canada to protect that drug supply, not only from the pricing, but from the export of drugs within their country. So when this program is implemented, it's not just coming from Canada into the United States and then going to the pharmacy. It comes to Detroit through one point of entry, because that's the point of entry where FDA said that the drug should come to. Then it goes to this temporary warehouse where it's sampled, and you have to take a sampling of a certain representative number of each dose. It's tested. Then it's relabeled. Then it goes back to Detroit for then FDA to sign off on it. Those are all more and more touches of this product, more and more opportunities for mischief, more people who want to take a piece of the pie. And so just the implementation logistics at the border to get this product into the United States are tremendous.
And I think that's one of the probably many aspects of how this program is much more complex than it looks at face value, because you mentioned there's a hidden cost because you have all of these different extra steps that need to be implemented with relabeling, repackaging. That all costs money. And then you have this hidden cost of the implementation at the border and beyond, as you mentioned. And that doesn't seem to be really built into the overall program cost right now. It seems like a very simple equation of you import cheaper drugs, and then somehow these cheaper drugs get in the hands of people who get them for cheaper as well. And it doesn't seem like that is quite as simple.
No, logistically, just coming from Canada to the United States, it's a moving target. And then when you get to the pharmacy, it's more logistics, more a moving target, because in the pharmacy, you've got this issue of the commingling of the supply. You have the US version and you have the Canadian version. And although patients may not be able to tell the difference, from a pharmacy perspective, there's a lot of logistical issues there, because on your shelf, you may have the US labeled product and this relabeled imported product. So if you have a Medicaid patient that's coming in, they're supposed to get the relabeled imported. But what if they don't want it? The NDC, that drug code, if you fill the prescription with that other, the US-based one, and you use that drug code, then there's a different price attached to that sometimes. And so that creates some more logistical issues. And what if a patient comes in as a Medicaid patient and you're out of the imported version? Do you tell the patient to leave and come back another day? That patient may not come back. And you don't want to send a patient away without their prescription if you can't do that. And then adverse event reports. What if you hear if there is a adverse event related to the product? Which one is it? Which do you report it to? So there's so many different things. And even if there is, let's say there mischief occurred and a pharmacist can look at a package and look for red flags to indicate whether or not a product is a suspect product of counterfeit or some sort of illegitimate product. But they can't look at a product itself to say, oh, like the tablet itself, to say whether or not it's substandard. That's hard. And so these counterfeiters are really, really good. So some of that stuff is quite scary. Some pharmacies have actually turned to using outside labs to check the authenticity and potency of drugs. And patients should have the confidence in their pharmacist. And we can't have patients questioning the quality and validity of drugs that they get from their community pharmacy or their hospital or wherever. So what this does is it really undermines that confidence. And we're going to have to do a lot in order to make sure that patients continue to have the confidence they have not only in the pharmacists, but the drugs that they get from their pharmacies.
Are you equally concerned about the part that happens in Canada? So before drug gets to the border, do you see similar risks in terms of mischief, as you say, where drug can be diverted or substituted with counterfeit product or substandard product? Or is it truly the starting point is at the border?
One of the things that the Drug Supply Chain Security Act did is it really created a closed drug supply in the United States, identifying who is in the supply chain and what is in the supply chain and where it's been in the supply chain. That created a nice closed, safe system. And so once something is in the supply chain legitimately, those safeguards are there to ensure that the right authentic product is getting to the patient at the pharmacy. So those opportunities for mischief that occur before the product comes to the United States, and that vulnerability of through this process, a substandard or counterfeit drug is getting into our closed supply chain.
Okay, so it is actually the opposite. It's really the part before the border that is the critical issue for you, because we don't know exactly where the drug might come from. We don't know who handles it, or there might be a lot of people handling it. And at every step, there's a little bit of a risk because we are outside and before that drug supply security chain.
Yeah, but all of that, the relabeling really opens that door as well.
How do the community pharmacists, what do they think about this program? Because you mentioned a few things that to me just sound like a recipe for complexity and potential errors. The things that you touched on are you have these parallel inventory on the shelf, potentially, of two drugs that have both US labels, but hopefully somehow differentiated so you can easily tell the difference. But, pharmacies are busy, these high volume pharmacies, you have a new tech, they grab the one bottle versus the other bottle. They both have the same drug name on them. There's confusion in terms of reimbursement because they're using the wrong NDC number for the wrong program, or they're out of one stock versus the other. What do you do? There's probably half a dozen other things that could be confusing in this scenario as well. So the community frontline pharmacists, are they aware of this issue? Do you have a sense of, are they more for it? Are they seeing those complexities? What are they thinking?
Yeah, the community pharmacy community is, for the most part, not in favor of this. So when the regulations were being written, and even going back to the early 2000s, the pharmacy community was very vocal against this for many reasons that we've talked about here. But when the regulations were being developed, there was a proposed rule and a final rule. At the American Pharmacists Association, where I am, we had some large writing campaigns that we offered for our members to send a letter to FDA for the official record to express those concerns. And I can't remember the specifics, but it was a pretty good turnout of concern that was raised from the pharmacy community. And even after the regulation was finalized, our members and those at other pharmacy organizations, we band together and expressed our concern and sent letters to FDA. And just last week, there was a letter that was sent to FDA jointly with the Pharma Trade Association, as well as several pharmacy organizations expressing concern about the approval of the Florida program. So I think generally across the board, pharmacists are concerned. Just they were taught that FDA is the gold standard across the world. And that's where we ensure the safety and efficacy and quality of our products. So we don't want to question that.
Have the AMA or other organizations, like on the medical provider side, do they have an opinion on this? I wonder if they're just too far removed or if the physician world has some of these similar concerns.
That's a good question. They're certainly not as vocal as the pharmacy community.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
So, Ilisa, do you see any future of drug importation programs at all? Do you think there's ever a scenario where this could work, both from a safety perspective as well as from a logistics perspective? Having listed all of the different things that could go wrong potentially, is there any scenario where this could work from your perspective?
Not based on the current technology, because look, there are so many different innovations in technology that could maybe even better assure the legitimacy, authenticity of the product, but those aren't there. And, there are even bills that in the past that want to expand the program even larger to OECD countries or other English-speaking countries. But the problem there, Canada is a pretty big country. Some of these other countries are smaller. They have smaller budgets to even surveil their own markets to know what's there. So that creates more opportunities for mischief. So every year we look to see what new bills are going to be introduced. And right now there's a program in place and we're waiting to see how that launches. So I hope that we're not going to see bills to even open the program more broadly, while we're even seeing if one country works.
And of course, the three of us tend to agree with each other, I suppose, since Nari and I, work for pharmaceutical manufacturers. And of course, you're with the APHA and kind of representing the pharmacists' position on this, which we tend to all agree. I guess the other, just to be devil's advocate, I suppose, Florida, I'm guessing, would argue that these medications are expensive. These programs, that the budgets that the drugs hit are expensive. and they can save some money and do wonderful other things with those cost savings. Going back to your earlier comments, it sounds like they're not being entirely transparent in terms of what those savings would be and how they would really occur on a net basis. But are there any other benefits? Like, what else is Florida trying to get out of this other than just trying to save some money? And the last thing I'll say, and I'll let you answer, is there are other ways to save money in these programs. This isn't the only thing you can do. So I just wonder why they're focused on this one, and not just Florida, other states as well. We'll wait and see if New York and Texas and California, the other big population states, probably are watching this closely. But it'll be an interesting experiment, I guess, for better or worse, to see how Florida fares with this.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. There's a lot to unpeel there because the pricing of drugs in this country is so messed up, and how it's priced and the whole reimbursement policy. So everyone's trying to say that they have a solution to fix it. And it's a multi-layer fix here, really. And so from a politician's point of view, you want to say that you're going to lower drug prices for the people in your state. And what can you control? What comes in and out of your state? And so that's where they're turning to without really showing the people in their state that they're really not importing Canadian prices. And they're probably even saving more money right now, particularly for these programs. Look at all these novel ideas and ways in order to rein in drug pricing in this country. And I think this is just one of them.
Yeah, I think we also agree that there's many things maybe about healthcare delivery and pricing in particular that could be improved. So I think we probably are all on the same page here, not trying to present the idea that all that is working perfectly and we should just accept the way things are today. I just struggle with thinking how this is a particularly good solution to the problem they're trying to solve. But we'll see. That's one of the interesting things that states get to do. They get to act independently, and we'll see what works and what doesn't work. And I think there'll be a lot of eyes on this to try to figure out where this is going in the future from all interested parties, I suppose.
Yeah, well, let's focus on the PBMs. Let's figure out their role in the drug pricing scenario in this country, particularly what can states do to rein that in for drug price control.
That is definitely a topic that's coming up.
Yeah, we're still waiting on the PBM resolution or solutions, maybe. That it seems like they are going to live to fight another day here recently. They got to pass on a few things. We'll see. I'm sure their day is coming as well. But yeah, that's another topic we definitely want to explore.
One of the things that drug importation opens is the door for consumers to think that drug importation generally is okay. And it isn't. It is illegal to import drugs personally and for your own personal use for individuals. And because of the internet, it makes it easy for these rogue online pharmacies. They're not really pharmacies, they're online sellers to offer drugs for Americans to buy drugs because they're all looking for ways to save money. And so what this legal drug importation does is it channels that legitimacy falsely of the online drug sellers. And so that's really important. And, I'm involved and APHA is involved in a number of efforts to educate consumers on how to buy drugs safely. Of course, we want patients to go to their pharmacy, their local pharmacy, their community pharmacy, where the pharmacist knows what they're on and can help them. But some are going to look outside for other ways. And buying drugs online is not a safe option, but there are tips that come from FDA and the Alliance for Safe Online Pharmacies and APHA for how to do that safely if you are going to turn to the internet. But overall, that's illegal to buy drugs from outside the country and then import them for personal use.
An important reminder of the premise of this discussion. I think good that you mentioned that. So it sounds like we'll have to see a little bit how this goes. If the big promise of cost savings will actually hold true, and you mentioned $180 billion, that's a large sum. I would be curious to see where that comes from if it happens. But of course, I think more importantly is really, can we do this safely? At the end of the day, the most important thing is that patients get the medication that they expect to get. And if there are any risks with patient safety, I think we need to be really watchful here and quickly to course correct. This was a really great discussion, or more, I think, education from you, Lisa. So thank you so much for enlightening us about this very, very complex and very nebulous topic. I think there's just a lot of unknown here that we need to understand more about. But thank you for highlighting the complexities of this program and the many aspects that maybe are not as much in the news as the headlines of cost savings. I wanted to just ask you a last question, which is, with your really interesting and storied career path, and you have such an interesting background as a pharmacist and as a lawyer, and you've worked in different settings, is there somebody or something that has guided you along this path? Something that has stayed with you as your guiding principle as you think about your work?
That's a great question. I get inspired by everything that's around me. And I know that sounds silly, but let me explain. So one of the beauties of working at the American Pharmacists Association is we're right on the National Mall, the only privately owned building on the National Mall. Lincoln Memorial is right across from me. And I'm a runner. So I'll run before work or I'll run after work. And when I run, I'm passing the monuments to all of the people who have come before us, the heroes at the wars, the presidents, the Supreme Court, the judges who make the law, Martin Luther King and all that he's done. And even just an arm's length away, just 50 feet away from APHA, is Albert Einstein. And so on my runs, I'll pick a monument and try and run closer to it and then spend more time there and just get inspiration from the people who really laid the groundwork for our country and what we do, what we all do today and can do, whether it's in the law, in humanity, or in justice. So it may sound corny, but it really does bring back to me all that people can do and will do in this country. And then I end up back at APHA breathing heavily, of course, after my run, and then really think about, so who's going to inspire me tomorrow on my next run?
I love that story. You're in good company on your runs.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love that, and inspired me to want to get back to DC and do another tour of all the monuments that I don't get to see as often as you. But I could see how that would be a great way to start your day, except for the running part. But other than that, I think it sounds great.
Well, stop by and visit when you're in DC.
It's a deal.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This was a great discussion, a subject I didn't know a lot about. Of course, I'd heard about it. It's probably all in our minds a little bit to see how this is going to develop. So we'll all learn that, I guess, together. But thank you for helping with the historical context and highlighting those, as Nari said, the issues that really should be most important to us beyond the cost savings. And there are many for us to think about, and how we're going to structure something that works for everybody, all stakeholders involved, certainly patients, but there are other stakeholders that have interests here too. So great discussion. Appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Ian and Nari. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Lisa. I have to admit, I don't know as much about this topic, Ian. So I asked a lot of annoying questions, probably, just because I really tried to better understand what is the value proposition of this program. And it sounds like a lot of that is unclear. There's a lot of risk involved. And Ilisa was very clear when I asked her, is there any future, or does she think there's any way that this can work? I think she's basically just said no. Let's see if that's true. I mean, partially, I think the idea is very compelling. And if there were a safe and legal and patient-friendly way of doing it, maybe that's something to consider. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like we're on that path at all.
Yeah, and it can be. I can understand how it would seem to be a compelling argument for the general consumer or politicians. I can see how they bite on this, right? So the idea is that, well, it's the same drug. It's in Canada already. It's cheaper. And let's just bring it in from there and save money. Seems simple. Like, what could go wrong? And I think if you only frame it up that way, it seems like an obvious choice. Well, sure, we'd want to do this, right? I get why this was considered, but like a lot of things, it is more complex, and there are other really important considerations that aren't reflected in that initial framing that should be up front and center, and namely safety and integrity of the supply chain certainly has to be the highest concern. And boy, this seems to open up a bunch of opportunities for bad things to happen. And look, there's been decades and decades of work to ensure the safety, integrity of our drug supply chain here in the United States. To throw all that away, I think would be a mistake. And in some cases, you're doing just that. And then, the other thing is I just worry about Canada a little bit, frankly. I don't see what's in it for them. I think there's a lot of potential risk that they're undertaking for very little benefit. This isn't going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs in Canada. The manufacturers, as the drugs or the wholesalers, I should say, in Canada, when the drugs flow through their hands, aren't going to make a lot of extra money on this. But they are potentially putting their supply chain at risk. And I do believe manufacturers could put upward pressure on pricing in Canada. So I see a lot of downsides for Canada and not a lot of upsides. So I wonder what they're going to be doing to protect themselves. The manufacturers are going to make some moves to protect themselves. So I guess all that is to say I'm skeptical that Florida and these other states may actually realize the cost savings benefits that they think they're going to realize in the long run. But we'll see. Time will tell, and maybe they'll prove me wrong. But I'm a little skeptical it's going to work out as rosy as they're projecting right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think on the front end for Canada, it certainly doesn't seem like a super compelling case here. So let's see what happens. We'll monitor it, and then maybe we can return in the future in another episode and evaluate a little bit if any of our predictions came true or what happened to this program.
Yep, exactly.
All right. Until then.
Thanks so much, Nari.
Bye, Ian.
Thank you for listening. Please visit us at realpharma.co for more valuable resources. Real Pharma is brought to you by Black Canyon Ventures.